Yeah, in a general sense, yes. Okay, as Hashem, let's begin Masechta Shabbos. So before we start the Masechta, just a quick introduction. We have Zachor v'Shamor. So Zachor, we imbue Shabbos actively with Kedusha, and Shamor, concept of Shamor in general, is understood by refraining from certain behaviors in order to maintain the atmosphere, the presence of Shabbos as it's supposed to be. So now, regarding this idea of Shamor, as we begin Masechta Shabbos, there's Isurei Malacha that exist on Shabbos. We know there's 39 Isurei Malacha, and those 39 Malachas, as the Gemara is going to teach us, were the Malachas, the actions that were used in construction of the Mishkan. It's actually very appropriate that we're beginning these Parshias, beginning this Masechta in Truma, Tetzav, Kisisa, these Parshias that discuss Melechas HaMishkan. So now, regarding this idea of Isurei Malacha, there's 39 Isurei Malacha that are called Avos, Av Malachas, which were particular actions done in association with the Mishkan. And if it's an action that is very similar, it's also considered part of the Av. But then we also have what's called Toldos, or some pronounce it Tolados, which are considered under the same category, subset or subcategory of the Av. Essentially, in terms of punishment or chiyuv, they're the same, essentially. We know in general, if somebody is Mechalel Shabbos, he does one of these malachos. So we know that the halacha is, if it's B'shogeg, it's chayav korban chatas. If it's B'mezid, he's chayav kares. If it's B'mezid with Eidim and Hasra, witnesses and warning, he's chayav skila. That's the general rule. Now, our Mishnah, the beginning of Masechta Shabbos, begins in discussing the malacha of Hotza'ah, specifically. Hotza'ah is the transference of an item from one rishus, one domain, to another domain, particularly from a domain, a private domain, a rishus hayachid to a rishus harabim, or vice versa. Now, to be technical, there's actually hotza'ah and hachnasa. Hotza'ah is taking an item from a private domain out to a public domain. That is the av malacha. The tolda is hachnasa, which is bringing from a public domain back into a private domain. Essentially, they're the same thing, but the psukim highlight the idea of hotzah, so that's the av, and the tolda of it is hachnasa, bringing it back into the private domain. Rashi quotes the pasuk that we learned this from, which is Moshe Rabbeinu commanded the people on Shabbos not to bring things from the Machane Yisrael, which was like their domain, private domain, out to Machane Levia, which was considered public domain regarding them. That would be the Isser. Tosfos quotes a different pasuk regarding the Mon. They weren't allowed to collect Mon on Shabbos because they would have to bring their Kli from Rishus HaYachid in their domain out to public area. That would be an issue. So they will go, as when we get to the Gemara, we'll discuss these rayas, these sources more, but the point is, that's the potential sources. Tosfos also gives three explanations why the Masechta begins with Hotza'ah, which is a unique concept. Usually, the way other Masechtas go is, it's chronological in terms of the Mishnayos and the Prakim. So you'll start where those halachas begin, and in the context of Shabbos, l'chara, you should start from Erev Shabbos. Preparations for Shabbos Yisurim, that might begin on Erev Shabbos. So Tosfos gives three explanations as to why it begins with Hotza'ah. One of the explanations he says is, it's the most commonly discussed, and it happens to be, or common reality on Shabbos, and the Masechta actually, in a far more significant way, discusses Hotza'ah than the other malachos. So that's just as a brief introduction. Now, regarding Hotza'ah,
just say, what are the reasons that he says again?
I didn't say all three, but we can go through them if you'd like.
I'm saying okay, the one you...
he says three terutzim.
Even the one you said I didn't get.
The one he said is the davar hahova ragila shas lishnos techila. The more commonly occurring phenomena that the Shas Mishnayos will begin to discuss first. So Hotza'ah seems to be more common than the other malachos or the other phenomena. So therefore it discusses it first.
Cooking is more common.
I guess that's what he says. That's Rabbeinu Tam. I hear. He goes through two other terutzim.
Every day too.
Yeah. Taisa goes through other terutzim also. You can take a look.
And cook for a week.
Not to get stuck on the point, I'm happy to go through it after.
Okay.
So the point is as follows, regarding Hotza'ah, regarding this Isser of transference from one Rishus to another, we're going to have essentially three categories of the Chiyuv or the Isser associated with Hotza'ah. This is really going to be discussed in the other Malachos as well. Regarding Hotza'ah, there is something that's Asr Mid'Oraisa, and like we said before, what the punishments would be if it's Asr Mid'Oraisa. there is what's Asr Midrabanan, and then there's something that's not Asr at all. Now let's just illustrate outside, and then we'll see it inside the Mishnah, and it'll be very easy to read through as we understand this. To be chayav for otzah, for transferring an item from one domain to another, again, Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim, private to public or public to private, or meaning either way, it's necessary to be chayav mid'oraisa for one person to do an akira, which is a lifting or a uprooting of that item from one domain, and then hotzah, which is taking it into the other domain, and then a hanacha, which is a placement, putting it down in the other domain. That would make somebody chayav mid'oraisa. And again, like we said, either achatas, kares, skila, all depending on the scenario, but he'd be chayav on a da'oraisa level, because one individual did both akira and hanacha regarding that item, from one domain to another. What's that? Machshava. Okay, let's leave out machshava for now. We're not going to get into that today. That is to be chayav mid'oraisa. Mid'rabanan, it's going to be usher if they share in the practice, which means if one party does the akira and the other person does the hanacha in the other domain, this will be usher mid'rabanan, which is considered the concept of pater aval usher. You're pater, but it's still usher mid'rabanan. Finally, and this is really back to the scenario of mid'oraisa, if one person does the akira and the hanacha, and there's a passive individual, as we'll see in the Mishnah, who's engaged, but he's not doing anything, what he's doing is mutter lechatchila. There's not even an isser in the first place. Let me just illustrate with the first cases the Mishnah will discuss, and then we'll get right into the Mishnah. The Mishnah illustrates this, as the Mefarshim here explain, with a common example to make things easier to understand. It's very interesting that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi compiled the Mishnayos in an easy-to-understand format. So instead of saying, if you have one person standing outside and one person standing inside, he gave an example of a person who may be standing outside in the public domain and a person who would commonly be standing inside the private domain. And what are the words that he uses? An ani and a balabayas. A poor man and the homeowner. So a poor man comes to the door of the balabayas, seeking bread, let's say, and he's standing outside in the public domain, and the balabayas is standing inside in Rishus Yachid in the private sector. Good. If the ani would pick up his basket from the public domain, he just did an akira b'shus harabim, and then he would stretch his hand through the door into the private domain, and he would put it in the hands of the balabayas. Putting it in the hands of the balabayas itself constitutes a hanacha, because putting it in his hands and he's in a private domain is considered a hanacha. So the ani will be chayav mid'oraisa for the akira in the public domain, hanacha in the private domain, but the balabayas was passive. He didn't do anything. He didn't do half of malach. He didn't do anything. So for the balabayas, as Rashi learns over here, it's mutter lechatchila even. There's no isser at all in what he's doing. That's going to be the first examples that we'll see in the Mishnah. The second grouping of examples will be isurei d'rabanan. So let's just illustrate one example of that, and we'll go through them. It'll be very easy. Ani picks it up in public domain, stretches his hands through the door. Balabayas takes it from him and then puts it down in Rishus HaYachid. So now, Ani did the akira, Balabayas did the hanacha. This is going to be pater aval aser.
Where's he stretch his hands? Where's the hands go?
Into the private domain. In the private domain.
The boss puts his into the shus harabim.
No.
The Ani put the basket inside, and the Balabas
picked up a basket,
put
his hands in. Ani lifts up a basket, puts his hands into the Rishus HaYachid, Balabais takes it from him, puts it down. Now what's happened is, Ani has done akira, Balabais has done hanacha, it's pater aval aser. They're not chayav mid'oraisa, but it's aser midrabanan. And what's the logic in this iser?
You're going to make a mistake.
Because what could happen potentially is if you do half of the maisa, you might do the entire thing, which is an iser d'oraisa.
Technically, the ani did a lot more.
That's an excellent point,
right.
And we're going to focus in on that point later. What Reb Klonomus just said is very important. Is the ani did the akira, the start of the issue here, and that is going to be a very important nikud that we'll get to later.
He also did the transfer of domain.
That's also true.
He did 2
so we're going.
3.
Beautiful. So we're going to focus in on that point later in regards to the number that the Mishnah uses to illustrate the different cases of Isser. So let's start the Mishnah now. The Mishnah says, Yetzios HaShabbos, Tapa Beis Mud Aleph, Yetzios HaShabbos. Yetzios means transference of domains. When it comes to Shabbos, of the Isurim, Shtayim Shehen Arba. There are 2 which are 4. Now 2 means there's 2 Isurei Da'iraisa, which with another 2 that are Asr Midrabanan makes a total of 4. Bifnim, for the fellow who's standing inside, we'll call him the Balabayas. Vishtayim Shehein Arba Bachutz, and there's also 2 which are 4, 2 Isurei Daraisa, which are 4 because there's 2 Isurei Drabanan. Bachutz, outside for the ani who's standing outside. Now, since the Mishnah introduced Bachutz second, it begins to elaborate on that first. This is the derech of Mishnayos sometimes, where it'll introduce topic 1, topic 2, and then elaborate on topic 2, and then go back topic 1. Let's see. ABBA. We had this, I believe, in Maseches Nedarim. We have different Masechtas. Ketzad. So let's begin. Let's illustrate what are the Isurei D'Oraisa, the Shtayim of the ani who's standing outside Bachutz. Ketzad. Ha'ani oimed bachutz. If the ani is standing outside, ubalabayis bifnim, and the balabayis is standing inside in the private domain. Pashad ha'ani es yadai lifnim. The ani stretches his hands inside. He's holding a basket. Okay, let's say, just for clarity's sake, he's holding a basket. He wants to give the balabayis to put bread into, just to make it a little more relatable. So the ani picks up a basket in public domain. He stretches his hands into the private domain and passes a basket to the hands of the balabayis. He puts it in the hands of the balabayis. That's case number 1. Oh, or alternatively, the ani, the ani stretches his hands into the private domain with nothing in his hands, and he takes from the hands of the balabayis bread, let's say, v'hotzi ha'ani, and then the ani takes it. He did the akira in the private sector. The ani did it. He takes it out to the public domain, and let's say he puts it down. V'hotzi, and he takes it outside and then puts it down into the public domain. Ani chayev. The ani is chayev in this case because in these two cases, because he did the akira and the hanacha. Again, the first case did the akira outside, the hanacha inside. Second case did the akira inside, the hanacha outside. Balabayis pater, and the balabayis pater. And as Rashi says, balabayis pater doesn't mean pater avalasar even. Mutar lechatchila, because he was passive. He did not do anything in these two cases. This is the examples of shtayim that are usr, 2 scenarios of isur d'oraisa for the ani who is bachutz. Let's move on. Now let's go back to the 2 isurim of the balabayis who's bifnim. Pashat balabayis es yado. Now the balabayis is standing inside. He stretches his hands holding on to bread. Let's just, for clarity's sake. He picks up a piece of bread in the private domain. He stretches his hands through the door into the public domain, lachutz outside, v'na'asan l'soch yado shel ani, and he puts bread into the hands of the ani. Okay, so this is going to be where the balabayis did akira and rishus hayachid, and then put it in the hands of the ani and rishus harabim, which is hanacha in public domain. Oh, or alternatively, shenatal mitocha, the balabayis stretches hands that are empty outside into the public sector. He took something from the hands of the ani, and then the balabayis entered his hands back into the private domain and put it down. So in this case, balabayis chayev, because he did the akira and the hanacha by himself, the ani pater. And again, the ani is completely pater, it's mutter, he didn't do anything in terms of the isurei Shabbos over here. So these are, so far we illustrated the 2 cases of isurei d'oraisa for the person standing outside, 2 cases of isurei d'oraisa for the balabayis who's standing inside, where they did each both akira and hanacha. Good. Now let's move on to the Shehein Arba. So what are the additional Isurei Drabanan associated with the balabayis and associated with the ani? Pashat ha'ani es yado lifnim, if the ani stretched his hands inside. So the ani was holding something and he stretched his hands inside from the public domain into the private domain. But he didn't put it in the hands of the balabayis, thereby doing an akira and hanacha by himself. But v'natal balabayis mitocha. The balabayis took it from the ani and then put it down in the private domain. So in this case, we have the ani doing the akira in the public domain, balabayis doing the hanacha in the private domain. Oh, alternatively, shenasan letocha is that the balabayis picked something up. He put it in the hands of the ani who had stretched his hands inside. Vehotzi, and then the ani brought his hands back outside and put it down in public domain. So here the balabayis did the akira, the ani did the hanacha. So in this case, shnehem peturin. Now comes Rashi, says, 1 second, this peturin is not the same as before. They're both pater, but it's aser, because each one did half of the maisa of hotza'ah, and here Chazal came along and said a gezerah. What's the gezerah? If you do half of the isser of hotza'ah, you might do the entirety of it. Now I want to be very clear about this for a second. The fellow who did the akira, let's say the ani lifted up an item, put his hands into the private domain, the balabayas took it from him. We understand logically there's a gezeira there because he might actually finish it off and do the hanacha, which is an isser daraisa.
But the balabas can't do it.
Balabayas just did the hanacha.
Right,
so what's the gezeira then? It still exists, but what's the gezeira? If he does hanacha here, in a future setting, he might do akira and hanacha, so it's also usher to do that lechatchila. Okay, just to be clear. Now let's do the flip side. Pashat balabayas, meaning the person standing inside. Pashat balabayas es yado lachutz. The balabayas picks something up in the private domain, does akira, stretches his hands outside. V'nat ala ani mitocha. He doesn't put it in the poor man's hands, but rather poor man takes it from him. So the balabayas did the akira. The ani does the hanacha. O shenasan letocha, or he put something, he took something from the ani's hand. Means the ani had picked something up in the public domain. Balabayas took it from him. The hichnis, and then the balabayas brought it inside and put it down. So that's where the ani did the akira in the public domain. The balabayas did the anacha in the private sector. Shneim patur, and again the same thing. They're both going to be patur aval aser. Okay, now there's a very important point we have to finish off with before just to understand this Mishnah at face value. The Mishnah says that where you have, that you have shtayim shehin arba, 2 which are Asr Dairaisa, which are total of 4 altogether for the Ani and for the Balabayas, right? Total of 4. So comes along Rashi, and Rashi says the obvious issue here. It's not 4 cases of Isser, there's actually 8, based on what we said. Because you have the 2 Issurei Dairaisa for each one, for the person standing outside, the person standing inside, as we illustrated in the first part of the Mishnah. But then we illustrated 4 more scenarios where he said both of them are doing something that's Assur. So really it should be Shtayim Shehein Shmona. Everybody see that? Meaning the number 4 is inaccurate. It really should be 8, because we had 4 more scenarios which are us midrabanan, and we said it's usher for both of them, both the person who's doing the akira and then the fellow who did the hanacha as well. That's a gezeira. So why does it say shtayim shehein arba? So Rashi answers. Gemara is going to clarify this later. He says like this: it's true, the fellow who does the hanacha in the Yisurim Drabanan cases is doing something usher, but the Mishnah does not include that in the count of Isurim, because really the one who could potentially lead to a greater Isur here at Dairaisa in this circumstance is the one who started by doing the Akira. So it's only counting in terms of the Yisuri Drabanan in our Mishnah, the fellow who started off with the Akira. And there's 2 akiras for the fellow outside, 2 akiras for the fellow inside. It's not to say that it's not usher to do the hanocha as well. It's just not counted in the overall count because the degree of severity or the issue that he could potentially do is not as severe. So even though it is usher, it's not included in the count because he only did the hanocha and not the akira. Okay, so we're going to stop here. But what we had in this Mishnah is 2 Isurei Dairaisa, 4 Isurei Drabanan. We only counted 2 of them because those are the ones who did the akira, the uprooting or the lifting up in their potential situation. Okay, Be'ez Hashem, we'll stop here at the bottom of Beis Amud Aleph, and we'll pick up tomorrow with Beis Amud Beis. Shkoyach, great to start Masechah Shabbos, Chaver. Be'ez Hashem, we'll pick up tomorrow.
I mean, the things I remember is Machshavas is a thing. Machlokas, whether